Oh, all throughout the day. I mean, tell me what you know about toxicology, besides the fact that we can OD and just prevent your child. What else? There's a lot in that chapter. What else?
I was surprised by the facts about, 80% of attempted suicide are drug overdoses, and you hear all the stuff in the news, guns are so bad, but 80% is overdoses, and then the kids ones is really what caught me off guard.
Yeah.
That the children who have an accidental ingestion is like 25% more likely to have another one within a year.
What do you think it is?
Obviously it's accessible to them, and if they get the attention from it.
Absolutely.
That was kind of where I was.
Absolutely. Yep. That's spot on what it is. What else? I'm not going anywhere all day long, so tell me what else.
I was really impressed with Korsakoff psychosis.
What's that?
Psychosis characterized by disorientation, muttering, delirium.
Have you seen that? Have you seen that?
I haven't on the slide, but
Have you seen that in the field?
I will say that I have seen that plenty of times.
Okay. So Korsakoff's versus what's the other one? Wernicke's. Okay. So there's a difference between Korsakoff and Wernicke's. We'll get there today. But why does it matter to you? Some old drunk that's been laying there on the street for 3 days. Why does that matter to you?
Just kind of a gauge of where they are in their addiction and their toxicology.
Yeah.
Because they walk around with a very high alcohol level.
Yeah. Sure so they live at a certain state. I mean, if you were to check blood alcohol content on somebody that's been on the street that has been doing alcohol for the past 3 days in a binge type thing, would it be Wernicke's or would it be Korsakoff? And the answer to that is we'll talk about that in just a little bit. What else, Jeff?
Well, so on that, we had a call. I shared it a while back. We indicated a guy that I thought was having a CBA ends up with DGs.
Yeah.
And he presented 100% totally like a stroke.
Yep. Absolutely. We'll talk about that a little bit. Tell us.
There's so many, I guess, prescription drugs that are easily, the amount you can take is so minuscule before you overdose. Why do they give it to people?
Great
Especially with
question.
depression.
Great question. What group of drugs that you should have read about that has a small therapeutic window? It's called a small therapeutic window. What's the group of drugs? TCA, okay? Tricyclic antidepressants. But to your point, there's a number of drugs, and especially antidepressants, that have a narrow therapeutic window. That is, if you take too much or too little, you're going to have a drastic effect along the way. The answer to that is the way that antidepressants are generally made up is they are all in that thing. So it's not like a perfect world that you can say, I'm not going to give you this because of the possibility of overdose. So there's problems that compound, especially the antidepressants. But TCAs are classic for it. We'll talk about that. What else? Should have read some other stuff in there.
I have a question.
Hang on just a second. You want me to start this? I think you're representing everybody else. No.
I didn't want to.
All right, folks. I told you last week, I'll tell you again today. Okay? I'm giving you just a reminder about this. Okay? I'm going to stand in front of you a whole lot during this module, and I'm going to press you on this. Okay? I want you to be able to pick up the material. If nothing else, if you're now reading every single line along the way, at least take a look at the chapter and come to see what the content is. It's important to you. And I'm not doing it just to be a jerk. I'm doing it because a week from today, you're going to have a whole lot of material to be tested. Okay? So make sure you take a look at the content.
So they spent a lot of time about carbon monoxide poisoning.
Yeah.
And I get that, the hemoglobin has a higher affinity for carbon than O2, but aside from the half-life, what unlocks that?
So oxygen, the answer to that is time and oxygen along the way, okay? So eventually just being out of the environment itself will take care of that if it's not severe. If we're talking about somebody that's severe, the possibility of hyperbaric medicine will be the answer to that. So I will tell you that we're only going to scratch on CO poisoning today. We're going to come back and talk about that with pulmonary issues in another week or so. Okay, so we'll just barely touch on that. Okay, did I see a hand over there somewhere?
Yeah, just the body breaks it down.
Yeah. Yep. So, and again, it takes a long time. If you took a look at that, it takes a long time in terms of getting rid of CO. Okay? All right, let's go. Can you guys see that okay?
Yeah.
All right. So when we talk about toxicology, we're talking about the study of, so drugs and poisons or anything. It can be anything. It can be the leaf on a tree outside. The idea in terms of anything that's going to have an effect on us. So there are toxicologists that generally are PharmDs. That is, they're pharmacologists, and they go on to specialize in toxicology. And so it is specialized field, but these guys and gals are experts in terms of what's going on. Some that are part of poison control centers, some that are just part of emergency departments and the like so. When we talk about toxicology emergencies, it results from the ingestion, inhalation, surface absorption, injection of toxic substances. So we talk about 4 different ways that you can take a substance in. That's 4 different ways. Okay? When we talk about poisoning, you just describe an exposure to a non-pharmacological substance. What does that mean? Non-pharmacological substance. Right. When we talk about overdose, usually describe exposure to pharmacological substances, whether accidental or intentional. The idea that we'll get into geriatrics in this module, the idea that we'll get into geriatrics, that grandma took too much of her blood pressure medicine because she's confused about it, would be a good example of somebody that's unintentional overdose, but still an overdose nevertheless that you're going to have to do something with. So for what it's worth, Poison Control Centers estimates that 4 million poisonings occur annually. What do you know about Poison Control Centers? I'm sorry, so you
I've called them once or twice for
Yeah.
call and from because of 911. They're very helpful, and sometimes it can be a little slow when you're on the phone. You're like,
Yeah.
come on.
Yeah.
But they always have the answer, but when the answer is, oh, contact the 911 system, you're like, crap.
Yeah, exactly. So the downside, if there is a downside, is that they will give you a generic type answer.
Yeah.
They're not going to tell you to intubate your patient. They're not going to tell you to hook up a monitor. They're not going to tell you to do a 12 lead along the way. But what they will do is they will give you a pretty good idea in terms of how this is going to be absorbed into the body, how it's going to be distributed, how it's going to be excreted along the way. Okay, so it gives you a little bit more information in terms of how this poison is going to control out. For example, has anybody ever called poison control or pediatric overdose of iron because they took too many gummies along the way? No. Yeah. So the idea in terms of the idea that I learned, or the thing that I learned by going through that, is that iron and gummies are high, especially in the pediatric population that wants to absorb an entire body. And what I found out was those kids will get worse quickly over a period of time. They know gummies.
Like,
Vitamins.
You know about gummies?
I don't have kids. I use kids.
I do something vitamins every single day. What's the matter with you?
Well, I go over your teeth.
Oh.
I give you a test grade drop.
I just love you so much. So for the rest of you, gummies and kids and iron is not a good thing. And so we'll talk a bit more about this. 10% of emergency departments are secondary to toxic exposure. That should be no surprise to you. Think about the number of people that you're bringing in that have overdosed on something. If alcohol or something else along the way, the idea in terms of what you're doing, that's your bread and butter. 70% of accidental poisons occur in children under 6 years of age. That's kind of going back to what's in. A child who's experienced accidental ingestion has a 25% chance of another similar ingestion. That's what we're talking about a second ago with Samantha. The idea that kids are curious, the idea that they get attention out of it, the idea that they get 911 that's called, and the idea that they get a visit is part of that. 80% of all attempted suicides involve drug overdose. Why is that a big deal to you, or should be a big deal to you?
Makes suspicion known as suicide.
Absolutely. So when you're hearing about staging for law, the idea that probably, again, no surprise, the idea that drugs or alcohol will be part of that scene, either because of overdose or just because of life, right? Serious poisons, especially in children older than 5, may be intentional by parents or caregivers. What's the youngest that you've seen with a child that has intentionally or unintentionally thought about suicide? What, just acted out or what?
Yeah, where they're hurting himself and his brothers.
Okay.
That was my.
Okay.
I had an 8-year-old who was like self-healing. He had a cast on his leg.
Okay.
His leg had been broken.
Yep.
Couldn't quite distinguish how.
Yep.
There was a little bit of language barrier, but not enough with this child to not be like, oh, I broke right in my bike. So like, it was very vague. And then he was cutting his cast and cutting himself.
So the idea in terms of cutting is because they're going through something. It may be suicide, it may be something else along the way, but cutting is symptomatic of something. Cutting yourself along the way. Talk about that. Well, anybody with true suicide type stuff? Yeah.
We had a 10-year-old that was both suicidal as well as homicidal for his family.
Okay.
And luckily everything, never wrapped it out on it, but he had plans like drawn out. For a 10-year-old, well scripted plan.
Yeah, which is kind of crazy all into itself, right?
Yeah.
Trevor, did I see a hand there? Okay.
I had a 9-year-old that was suicidal, had the full plan, wanted to take a bunch of pills, but
Okay.
his mom's cat.
Anybody that child has truly done
Yeah.
6-year-old. Okay.
We had one, she grabbed her parents went to Costco and got Costco-sized Tylenol jug.
Yeah.
A cup of Tylenol, a cup of water, a cup of Tylenol,
Yeah.
a cup of water.
So that
Tylenol, and she was eating her Tylenol.
that was my experience. I've had an 8-year-old who took half a bottle of extra strength Tylenol. You think that's a problem? We're going to talk about that in terms of Tylenol and aspirin. We think about Tylenol and aspirin as being nothing but, right? And so we're talking about both those here in just a couple minutes. Right? So the idea in terms of this, the idea in terms of, you think about 8-year-olds, they got a whole lot going on to live for in their life, right? They don't realize it, but they got a whole lot that's going on, and yet some of them are suicidal along the way. It's pretty crazy. Poison control center. So we're going to have, give me just a second here, because I'll tell you. We are going to have, on February 20th, somebody from Washington Poison Control Toxicology Center. That's going to be in and talking to you about it for an hour. So I'm not going to hang here. But the idea that if you haven't called these folks, do yourself a favor and take it for what it's worth. Put their number into your cell phone so along the way you have what you need. And so the idea that when that happens, dispatch is not always good. It's going to take time for dispatch to call somebody to give you the number. So don't delay in terms of that possibility. If you need that number, I've got it. I'm glad to give it to you. So we talked about this, and we're going to break this down here in just a second. But you should know there's 4 different ways in terms of taking some sort of a toxin into your body. Ingestion, inhalation, surface absorption, or injection. And depending on which route we're talking about, The idea they can have immediate or delayed effects. What would be an example of a delayed effect of those four?
Like the Tylenol.
Yeah, in terms of what it does, right? Right. But in terms of how rapidly it gets into the body, surface absorption, right? The idea that it has to go through the skin, and so it's dependent. We'll talk about it. I'm going to show my mouth. The idea in terms of ingestion, common agents, household products, especially with either intentional or a child getting into this. And so you see the other products, there's a possibility. Absorption occurs in the stomach and small intestine. So check this out and think about what we talked about with pharmacology. What's involved with this right here? Right here, there's kind of a big deal. What is involved that has to happen with this? What's first cast? Remember? Liver's involved, okay? So liver's going to take a beating for anything that takes place in terms of toxicology. Liver's a huge issue. What's another organ that's a huge issue? Kidneys, right? Because the kidneys are going to excrete most of the stuff that we're talking about, right? So the liver and the kidneys will play a huge part. Yes, cardiac, but the idea in terms of liver, because it's first pass, is kind of a big deal. Can involve burns to lips and tongues, depending on what the product is. Delay effects can be with absorption of poison from GI tract. So it goes from the liver into the GI tract. And so with that, depending on what the substance is, would be as to how long it's going to be absorbed and then transformed into the cells. Some poisons remain in the stomach for several hours and take a large bolus. How many of you have done the charcoal stuff with success, or did your patient resist that, or?
5-10 minutes in.
Yeah.
Mine was successful. She swallowed it like a champ.
Yeah.
We had to call poison control for this unknown hypertension medicine. I'd never heard of it. My medic had never heard of it. And poison control right away said, get her to drink as much as you have on your ambulance.
Perfect. Okay. Anybody else with more stories about it? What's a better way, you suppose, in hospitals that we're going to use that we talked about? Yeah, NGOs, YouTube would be the way they're going in hospital. So the idea that by getting rid of whatever the product is in the abdomen or in the GI tract, the idea that you can start pulling that out, but also giving absorption or giving charcoal. What does charcoal do? It binds to it, right? So the idea that it's going to be excreted at that point. The idea doesn't make it doesn't make it perfect in terms of that, but at least it binds to whatever that product is along the way. Okay?
So why have we gone away from it?
Great question. What's the answer to that? Why are we not using a lot of charcoal?
I mean, I know they say that it's not, they're saying it's not as effective, but it seems like it just got dropped off the radar when it used to push like crazy.
Yeah, so that's the challenge, and that's the balance, is that getting your patients to drink this black slurry type stuff is a challenge. And to what one of you were talking about, the fact that they gave it, Jeff was talking about, they gave it and then they upchuck with it along the way is the most common thing. So aspiration would be the downside to this. And I don't know that we've totally gone away from it. It just means that we're certainly not using it as frequently as we used to in the pre-hospital setting. What's the other drug that totally is off the radar now? It used to be there, certainly. So Evicac is the other thing that will cause them to vomit. That was my
So could you pre-dose someone's Zofran and then give them the charcoal?
So there's a question that the answer to that is maybe, depending on what the history is. And I've done that before. I've given them benzo along the way in terms of finding solution. It's worked very well.
Does patient attitude have anything to do with that?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So with what Christina was talking about, I would take a pretty good bet that you talk to your patient into doing this. You drink this, and it's going to help save your life along the way. It's a starting point in terms of that's up, right?
Yeah, we told her she is definitely going to die.
Yeah.
She took a great medicine.
Yeah. All right, so inhalation. Some common agents might include gases and vapors, fumes, and aerosols. Carbon monoxide certainly being the most classic one that we talk about, either with potential overdose or with wood burning stoves or something else along the way. Ammonia's in the news over the weekend, Spokane fire. Anybody had the opportunity of visiting with that this weekend? So I'm assuming that was all I had, man, yeah?
That's Trevor's area of expertise.
I wish I could say I knew anything about that.
Did you have a name or anything?
I didn't say I was right.
Very good. So the skating parks, the ribbon.
Oh, God.
It's used in the refrigeration process, ammonia.
Yeah, so they use it as part of the ice thing, and so that there was a release of the weekend. And as far as I know, they were still there this morning.
That ribbon is cursed.
I know, I don't think it's right. So ammonia, typically ammonia, where would you find it? There's all kinds of places. The answer to that is all kinds of places in terms of manufacturing and like so, and big old vats with that. Say again, Jeff? Farming. Yeah, farming is a good example of that as well. Absorption occurs via capillary alveolar membrane in the lung. Why does that matter? Yeah, there's that. But there's a term that I gave you a while back, and I won't go away. I said give you that term. What's that term?
Electricity.
Electric. Fake principle. Okay. And why does that matter? Yeah, watch my mouth. Why does that matter right here? So is it going to have an effect in terms of not only getting out breathe, but is it going to have an effect in terms of the pulmonary side? Yeah, absolutely. So we're talking about right heart failure. We're talking about the possibility of somebody in acute CHF. So we talked about this a second ago. Yes.
Can we take a couple moments more to talk about the inhalation? Yeah. Yesterday, my medic brought up something about pleural fibrosis.
Okay. Yep.
Where does that come into play with all of this?
So pulmonary fibrosis is not this per se. Okay. Pulmonary fibrosis is a disease all by itself on the pulmonary side. But the idea that you take anything in terms of product like this, you add something like that, all you're doing is exacerbating it based on this right here. This is the whole thing in terms of why that will get worse over a short period of time. Answer the question? Yeah. Okay. Good. We talked about surface absorption. Anybody have the poison ivy cell?
Yeah.
So my middle son, we're back east. We were living in Ohio at the time. My middle son did a bunch of yard stuff for young people. And there was over probably 2 different summers or so. He got into poison ivy, I think, about 6 different times. Each time, naturally, he's got to work along the way and try to get it for him. Okay? So the idea that you're on scene, you get called on scene for somebody to poison ivy along the way. Remember that he passed on to you. Okay? So be careful in terms of what you touch, who you touch, and everything else like that. Okay? What's the thing that you do not want to do with poison ivy? Starts treating. There's that. Yeah, well, it isn't so much getting wet, but what kind of temperature in terms of water? Cool water is the answer. Hot water will exacerbate it and keep it right along the way. Okay? Do not do hot water. Okay? Typically, because the skin, when hot water works out of the dust and everything else like that, will actually open it up, and so the poison ivy gets absorbed that much quicker. Right? So, going that way.
If you ever chop the garlic, get that oil on your hand and your skin and smell like garlic for hours. If you want your hands immediately with cold water, you can smell off right away.
Who would have thought? You think this guy's got some problems? Well, his problem becomes your problem, right? Well, what is he going to call you? He's going to call you right now because he got into a little bit of toxic. What's he going to call you? Chances are he's going to call you hours later when this right here not only gets absorbed but injection into him. Okay? And the cough is there and won't go away, and you're going to be calling for shortness of breath. Okay? So the possibility now you have not only absorption itself, but also the possibility of injection in terms of taking that in. Oh, by the way, what are some problems? What are some things in terms of how well this will work or not work as far as protection? I think a way to bring that question. So not necessarily sweating, but let's suppose this guy looks like his skin is fairly clean, right? Let's suppose this guy has skin all cut off because he's been doing mechanical work. Is there a possibility in terms of that being absorbed a little bit quicker along the way? So the skin's a barrier in terms of it, right? The idea that you're looking at somebody, they got poor skin, i.e. somebody that happens to be a frequent messenger that hooked up on something like this. The idea it will be absorbed that much quicker, and the protection's not there based on that. Makes sense? Long way around that line. Injection, talking about everything from illicit drugs to animal bites, and again, we're not going to talk about animal bite or stings within this chapter. We're going to do that separately outside of this. Substance enters directly into the body through a break in the skin. So the idea that when somebody is shooting up, the idea that it's going to take effect within just a matter of seconds, you should already know. Oh, by the way, someday someone will come again. The idea of be still along the way is the same type of setting. So you should know this already, but our scene size up begins somewhere else. That is the idea that you hear about a farming accident, you hear about somebody being exposed to something. You should start thinking en route to where you're going, the possibilities of what you're getting into. Are we talking about one patient? Are we talking about many patients? Are we talking about toxicology and hazmat are tied in together? By the way, there's a course out there, those of you that are hazmat freaks or hazmat interests, there's a course out there called Advanced So I'm going to think about that a little bit. So it's a 2-day course. I had the opportunity of doing that for 10 years. It's a 2-day course. It's still being offered. But what it does is it narrows you down to something about toxicology. So as we talk about toxicology emergencies, we talk about toxicones. We'll talk about that in the next hour. So toxicones are added into specific symptoms along the way in terms of how it happens. So it's an advanced hazmat course that kind of keeps you into that. So if those of you that have interest in that, you might want to check it out once I find out what the course is again. Take a note of where you are and what's going on around you. The idea in terms of the scene safety, we already know about that. We already talked about that. We talked about that for the rest of the literature here. Be alert of danger or signs of overdose. So the idea is you walk in, and not only is the scene safe, but what are you looking at in terms of scene? You're looking at pill bottles, you're looking at alcohol, you're looking at vomit, you're looking for anything else along the way. Okay? So the idea in terms of toxicology emergency, you have to have your eye, your head in a swivel as far as the possibility of walking into. All right, possibilities are endless. Take a break, come back in about, let's say about 5 minutes or so. There is no PowerPoint. The only one for today. Wednesday, 11 in the morning, we'll have Dr. Day, and you're about to read. Okay, catch you. Okay, so if at all possible, I'd be here for the lecture in the morning. Yeah, noonish or so. Okay, that's okay.
No, that's science, dude. That's fine. I was like, she's symptomatic, fine. You know, all of
Well, we here for this.
The arm weight is bigger than this one, this one, this one. Because of the arm weight. Hold on, weight. Elevations.
There you go, consistency is just trying to pass this next different page, else it's the that's one way to think about it. Yeah.
Don't forget about us. You can use it for us. We just want to about us.
I know, it's so tired.
Well, that's what's a challenge. It's a challenge. You
You gotta push through it.
Yeah.
Nah, I'm good. Go ahead. I'll take everything.
But you were talking about it. Yeah, and I tried to hard. No.
What did you
For some reason, I thought I should have 5:30. So it showed 5:15 to check the unit out. So I'm walking around.
Chapter in front of, remind me, we had a call this a couple of days ago. I'd love to bring on, might be good for class, but we could just take a couple of minutes.
Yeah, just remind me, towards the end of this one.
No, I was very proud of that Greenfield on Saturday. Well, halfway through our sports camp.
So the name of that course is Advanced Hazmat Life Support. Got to think about that. So Jeff comes from a farming community. Why is this a big deal?
It's easily available. It's pretty potent stuff. One thing we train on is ammonia or anhydrous. We have part of the training. We listen to the call. Control city first within probably 30 seconds. Get it going on, try to check the line.
I'll show you that before. So there's something else that we're talking about today, and that is organophosphate poisoning from crop dust. Now, it used to be very, very common that these plants would carry that organophosphate, okay? And the idea that it shows itself in a huge way in a short period of time, especially with a whole lot of patients along the way. They've gotten away from a lot of the organophosphate. I'm not sure, Jeff, you may know more than I do in terms of what these crop dusts are carrying these days. But I know that some of it is lethal. So we'll kind of talk about that.
A lot of this stuff, like so, those are more like insecticides and stuff.
Yeah.
And then they're putting in the ground. Now they're going to inject the anhydrous into the ground with the seeds. It attracts water, but down below.
Yeah. So again, back to our scene size. Begin your assessment with thorough evaluation at the scene. And I would just kind of stress to you again the idea of starting that at the door, based on what you're looking at, based on what's going on around you, based on your gut. What's the possibility? Okay, so take a note of where you are and who's around you, be able to alert for potential danger to you. The rescuer, look for signs of overdose, such as empty pill bottles, drug paraphernalia. So you already know that. The idea, again, from the door, are we talking about somebody with a critical airway? Are we talking about somebody that you need to do something with right quick? And so the idea that depending on which route that they've taken this agent is going to kind of determine as to which charges are going to be along the way. The idea that if we have somebody with inhalation secondary to some sort of like dust, the idea that this is going to become a big deal, and they may not have they have an ornamental status. They may be completely normal in terms of the mental status, and looking anxious and looking for you to do something along the way. It's important to find what toxin the patient was exposed to and when the exposure took place. Toxic effects develop over time. You knew that. The idea that as time goes on, the body's going to absorb. It's going to do the first pass. The idea that it's going to do its thing in terms of where the agent is. And so, as we talk about the 4 different ways through pharmacology, we talk about 4 different ways the body's going to take this in is what we're talking about right here. But the idea that you can have an effect in terms of trying to diminish or get rid of the agent itself. With unresponsive patients, rapid head to toe, signs of trauma is consistent or inconsistent with suspected toxin. As Christine was talking about her patient from this weekend, was it a fall that created this? Was it the medical problem that created this along the way? It's the same thing here. We're talking about toxicology or agents that they call them to be unresponsive, or is it because they went down with a head injury as well? trying to get history from military survivors. You know, you're running downtown, and you know what that's like as far as trying to get tied down to what's going on with your patient. That the story matches signs and symptoms. So in other words, I only took suicide attempt, 16-year-old. I only took 2 Tylenol, and you get the respiratory rate somewhere around 48. Is that consistent with that? Probably not. So trying to narrow that down. When we talk about decon, we're talking about just a simple decon to where they vomited on the floor, then no big deal. But if we're talking about that has an effect on a lot of different people, that becomes a big deal in terms of what you're going to do as far as decon. Reducing the intake of the poison if possible, reducing absorption of the toxin, and we're talking about activated charcoal within that. And then, what's catharsis? Catharsis. What is that? What is that?
Makes you go quicker, faster.
Yeah, kind of like jump for catharsis. Yeah, no, not exactly. Catharsis is something that's going to be only absorbed, like Doc's talking about, that's going to be passed out through your waste. So when talking about catharsis, we're talking about not only the liver, but the GI tract in terms of trying to get rid of that. It's something along the way that's going to induce diarrhea, to get something in terms of inducing whatever the content is. Like that. So in the hospital, they use catharsis to the greatest extent to try to get rid of that agent. So it may be bowel irrigation, may also be just something they give to try to get rid of the agent. So when we talk about an antidote, we're talking about a substance that will neutralize specific toxin or counteract the affected body. There are not many. So again, the toxicologists, the folks that are specializing in all this, they can tell you straight out from where the antidote is on the way. So the pre-hospital side, we don't have a whole lot of antidotes. We'll talk about a couple, but we don't have a whole lot of antidotes that are in our toolbox. Specific factors dictated by consultation with medical director. So I told you before, I'll tell you again today, the idea that I'm not calling drugging a whole lot, but the idea in this instance, I'm not talking about quality control, I'm talking about control as far as what you want me to do as far as treating specific toxins. Not necessarily the ABCs, but specific toxins in terms of possibilities. So here's a list. Let me do a couple that's probably worthwhile to remember. When we talk about anticholinergics right here, anticholinergics, atropine is the antidote for it. We talk about acetaminophen. We're talking about encostrine. We talk about cyanide. We're talking about amonitrate. Now we've been talking about that, right? Hydroxychloroquine. We're talking about, let's see, opioids. Obviously, we're talking about naloxone. We're talking about organophosphates. We're talking about atropine. All ones that are within your possibilities. Obviously, when we're talking about hypoglycemic, we're talking about dextrose or glucagon. What are we giving as far as calcium channel overdoses? Or beta blocker? Beta blocker overdose. Glucagon. What are we giving for calcium channel overdoses? Calcium, right? We're not carrying the pre-hospital side, but the benzos used to be at one point in time the pre-hospital side. We carried clobazam, also known as mazepam.
Are there any other antidotes for methanol poisoning? Or is that just like a...
There is, but and in all honesty, I would have to look at that. No point in time.
Fun fact in the G class they're talking about, you actually, not recommend, you get them stupid drunk because the body absorbs alcohol faster than
I'm on board with that. John Pitts told me that, so I'm just.
Yeah, we believe it. Suicidal patients, we talked about this a wee bit earlier, but the idea in terms of, and suicidal patients versus productive custody, if you have law enforcement, that's part of it. The idea, again, we talked about this a long, long time ago, in your first couple of days, the idea, especially with a youngster, the just kidding type thing has huge ramifications for you as well as a child. So just kidding, the idea in terms of possibilities are endless that we can get into.
Why do we be charged with abandonment if they say they don't want to go with us?
I'm sorry, say one more time.
Why do we be charged with abandonment if they say they don't want
I
to
go
go
to
with
a
us?
minor.
But their parents, they have their time where they want them to go either.
Then the idea at that point, you document and document and document well. The idea that you probably
I don't know if it's like our SOP, but I thought anytime somebody said that they want to do suicidal or they want to harm themselves or kill themselves, that they automatically block themselves right.
So great question. The idea in terms of that's where we get into productive hold or productive custody. The idea that you have law enforcement that's part of that. Law enforcement is the other side of that in terms of you can still either suicidal, you cannot force them to go. You cannot force them to go. But what law enforcement can do is put them in productive custody at that point.
Yeah, they do involuntary ITA the patient, so they're in protective custody or they're in a medical hold. They don't necessarily take the adult.
I'm ready to talk to all these.
Yeah, and so if you're talking here, that's the rock and hard place.
If they start fighting us now, only way we can make them is with that newspaper.
You actually, and then they go in the ambulance, and law falls, but law has to go, they go to the hospital, they're in the custody of that law enforcement officer. They wait medical health, mental health, and then, you know, they go decide where they go.
So if we suspect that he's going to commit suicide, parents will say, no, you don't, can we then call law enforcement?
Now the parents are very strong, but I would still make somebody aware about it. I would make the hospital aware about that. I would make law enforcement aware about that. Outside the fact you can't work with that. Yeah, it does. But you have probably seen it. The idea that you have a 60-year-old who responded because they broke up with a boyfriend or girlfriend. The possibilities are there for what you're walking into. So in all cases, not just suicides, but in all cases, vital congestion, when was congestion? We kind of talked about that a couple of slides ago. The type of toxins ingestion is going to be a big deal in terms of how it interacts in the body. The quantity if possible. Time elapsed since ingestion. If alcohol was part of that, if drugs was part of that, as far as a partner in that. Never ever would happen in Spokane, Washington, or North Idaho, although we got polypharmacy, right? So the idea that you walk on the scene and you see somebody with 10-point pupils, it means that only opioids is part of this problem, right? Never ever would they be doing something along the way with narcotics. So the idea that polypharmacy should be in your back pocket, hip pocket, as far as whether they eat you outside just one. Drug habituation or abuse as underlying medical illnesses and allergies. So this is huge, and especially later on. Last thing we're going to talk about with this lecture is alcohol. The idea that we get real complacent in terms of thinking about the wrong and not consider the possibility that hypoglycemia is going on or diabetes is going on and all that. There's cardiac issues undergoing with all that, and so we'll kind of talk about that. By the way, just FYI, those that are doing meth, those that are doing cocaine, are usually typically we're talking about young population or old population. Typically, so typically we're talking about young population, right? Because I think it's on the news that North Idaho was for somebody that was like 68 years of age that was doing that. So the possibility is young population. The reason I bring that up is this. We think a young population, like we were talking about last week, we think a young population, they all have young, healthy hearts, right? So they end up doing a year or two of meth or cocaine or what's else. What does that do in terms of coronary artery disease? It helps it. So you you should have possibilities of, even though they're a youngster, and they should have, it doesn't work that way, right? Let's go exam level of consciousness. Certainly is a possibility in terms of, are you going to do something with the airway? Are you going to do something in terms of trying to get breathing entry as well? Are we talking about, we're all in tune as far as somebody with constricted pupils as far as the possibility of nerves. But the idea that when they have dilation of pupils, what is that? And it might be, what else? What else could it be? Cocaine was should be another one. Huh?
MDMA.
Yeah, good. We'll talk about that.
So,
What else?
Pretty much anything.
Exactly. That's the point. To include shock, to include Tylenol, to include aspirin, to include a lot of different things. So when you're looking at the pupils, the list is endless for what you're getting into. Now, it's not necessarily helpful for what you're talking about. So with breathing, are they tachypneic or agonal? Or do they have a caustic injection that you know about? Are they in respiratory distress? Are they drooling all over themselves? Is there vomiting? So what do you want to know if you end up seeing vomit on? So is there pills within that vomit? The possibility of aspirin, what color was it? How much was it? Is there a history in terms of vomiting over the time? All things that's good together, and the toxicology wants to know about. Breath sounds, I'll be right there in just a second. Breath sounds, why? Outside of that, we should be breath sounds on just about everybody. Why?
Aspiration.
Yeah, aspiration is a huge thing. So what else outside of that? If there's a pulmonary component in terms of whatever they took in, are they going to have something wet lung sounds? Absolutely. So the idea of listening to breath sounds early on, and then tracking along the way is changing. Right? The respiratory therapist back there will tell you that that's what his bread and butter is, and especially with these things along the way.
So with the eyes again, what happens with speedball? You've got the heroin and the meth.
So again, that's what I was talking about before with that last slide. The idea in terms of polypharmacy, it may show up in terms of restricted pupils, it may be dilated pupils. So you're not necessarily going to know the polypharmacy, what are they doing? And so, am I telling you to do Narcan or all the overdose along the way? I'm not telling you that. I'm telling you, be smart for the possibility. Make sense? So that was the circulation. What are you thinking about? Skin. Are we talking about somebody that's pale, cool, diuretic? We're talking about somebody that's cyanotic. Are we talking about looking at EMR for the possibility? Flushing and staining. What does that mean? Flushing and staining. So flushing. Red, hot skin. Okay? Not all is going to be about cyanosis and their own food. So the idea that they have this red, hot skin is an agent that goes along with organophosphate. Talk about that during the comment. But organophosphate is not going to put their own food. They're going to flush along the way. Staining is you see anything that stains the skin. Start the pain in. Are they tachycardic? Are they bradycardic? Hypotensive, hypertensive, cardiac arrhythmia. So in terms of your care, let's go back one slide. In terms of your care, what do you want to do for this airway and breathing? In general, what do you want to do? How do you want to treat this?
EVM to start.
So the possibility of hypoxia, right? Starting point there. We need to get an airway active as cardiac, right? Do we need to bag this patient? As a paramedic, do you need to take their airway through? Is that a immediate concern? It should be when you're walking into where this patient agonal, and you're going to do that naturally. But the idea that when we talk about some sort of patient that's involved in that becomes a little more complex. As we get into substitute overdoses, aspirin, as we start talking about that, there's some dangers in terms of taking that patient and trying to bag them. So not everything is real clean in terms of taking care of this airway, taking care of this breathing. What about circulation? What are you thinking about? Like United started. Are we running fluids? Maybe. is fluids that make a huge difference in terms, just generally in terms of toxicology. Now, like, so unless they have to be hypertensive along the way, right? So what else? Circulation. Monitor, right? So not only a 3 lead, but a 12 lead, right? And then what else? What else in terms of monitoring?
SpO2.
So check, and you're right. But check this out. You have a patient that has taken, pick an agent, cocaine. How does it show up on the monitor? Okay.
Under 40, 150, just depends on when they took it.
So what happens when they get 160? So what are you doing there? It's a trick question. I'm saying, yeah, for a reason.
Bagel maneuver.
So narrow confidence, but they're not going to take it down.
I'm not allowed to.
So you're not going to do that? What's the matter with you?
It's like
Did
anesthesia, you have to treat
we
that.
teach you to try to bring that patient?
Well, if you're on state volume,
That's what everything tells you in your effect, right? So somebody that's tagging along with a lot of coaching on board, back on board, is a very low effect. You can throw electricity in all day long, so it's very low effect, slowing them down.
Yeah, because that's right.
Absolutely. Yeah, you have to think a little bit differently in terms of somebody, depending on what agent they're on. You have to think a little bit differently in terms of the first treatment. And Christina, I couldn't agree with you more. The idea that you're going to transport this patient somewhere else, that probably is not going to work well as far as a simple as now they have to be in a wide complex tachycardia. You can do something with that. Absolutely. If you do something in terms of blocks, absolutely. So listen to each other. I'm not telling you not to treat the patient because based on the agent. I'm telling you that depending on what the agent is, you may or may not have success based on this right here.
I think more the effect the agent has, right, than the agent itself.
Yeah. 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 So as we start talking about, we'll touch on it today. I can show will begin week, I think, and he's going to be talking to you about toxicology and ECGs together. And so as you start talking about blocks based on the age that's going on, that kind of ties in with it as well. Makes sense.
Is it going to have any effect on that patient?
Very little. It may or may not slow it down a wee bit, but that will give you, again, if you don't know, you're walking in, you don't know, and you look at the CT along the way, you're going to treat it that way. But when you don't get response off of that, you should start thinking about, I wonder what else they're on. Makes sense, right? So the cardiac arrhythmias, what can you see in terms of toxicology on board? Now that you're smart cardiologists and everything else like that, what kind of arrhythmias can you see? Absolutely. That's great. Absolutely.
Keep going with it.
So somebody I know with science, I mean what you but the answer is you can see it's a lot. You can see SVP, you can see a lot of research, you can see from the in terms of it's kind of endless as to what you get as far as cardiac rhythm. But the idea that you should be thinking early on, I need to get a monitor on this patient because you're that much smarter now. I need to get a monitor on this patient. I need to get a folio. I need to do some serious folio. See really how anything's changing. In terms of abdomen, for physical exam, abdominal pain. Is it common for somebody who has injected something? Is it common for them to have abdomen pain? Well, depending on what the agent is, the answer is yes. Sometimes no. Sometimes you're not going to have it, especially in the elderly population. They may not show up in SARS pain. Okay. Bouncing vomiting, we talked about this. The idea in terms of, and this is a big deal, and this is, you're going to get asked this question at the other end in terms of any nausea, any vomiting, any diarrhea along the way. Is Zofran going to help with his nausea? Maybe. That's exactly right. The answer is maybe. The idea, would you give it to him? Absolutely. If the abdomen is systemic or not, depending on how long they've been sitting in this agent, it may or may not be. Is there any possibility the abdomen is going to be hard and firm with this? No, depending on how long you've been living with this. We talked about the idea in terms of polypharmacy. Science is inconsistent with some diagnosis treatment may produce unexpected results. And that's kind of what I was talking about last slide with giving identity to somebody who has SVP may or may not work in this population. So we've kind of touched on some of the things already as far as management, but the idea in terms of if you have a possibility, you have access to an NGOG, this is good stuff, a good time to have it in place. Is it typical here for somebody who is alert oriented, put that dude down? No. But the idea in terms of does it make a difference as far as getting rid of whatever the content is in the abdomen? Yes. Would you want to save that to take it somewhere else along the way? The answer is always. This is a population where nasotracheal intubations exist. So you have a patient that's breathing along at about 2 or 3 times a minute, has an altered level of consciousness but still sitting there. Would be a possibility of going to nasotracheal intubation. Now these days that's kind of fallen out of favor in comparison to RSI. Would you still RSI this patient? Absolutely. But this is the population where nasotracheal still exists.
So when I was reading the book, it didn't really say why. I mean, why does this stick out from it?
Because typically, Laban, this population, when we have a patient that's all hyped up, that's breathing about 30 times a minute, nasotracheal intubation is not going to work. But what they're talking about is somebody that's just agonal, just kind of sitting there, still has an airway. This is the population that's going to work because you can get them to help swallow or help breathe along the way.
So why the nasal over just a ET tube?
You would, and these days with RSI in your back pocket, typically you would not. So it's more about your choice than anything else.
We have any preferred drugs that we like to use for RSI?
Yeah. So the answer to that is typically not, with the exception of always about K, right? Hyperkalemia, that we're not using Toxicology. There is, and Dr. Joe will get into this next week, but there's certain times when you would stay away from ketamine versus a topic. And so he'll talk about that a little bit more. So the answer is sometimes, but generally not a big deal. End title. Would you expect end title to be up or down?
Depends on the agents.
Okay, I'll buy a little bit of that. Up or down?
Well, you're going to have a lot of outlets going on at the cellular level, and then as you're hyperventilating too, pulling that out or down.
So if you're hyperventilating, then is it going to be down?
But if you were
So you're on the right track. You're kind of there. So think about somebody with aspirin overdose. Would you expect it to be up or down? Why? So all by themselves are going to be tachypnic, right? Then we'll talk about this in a couple minutes. Tachypnic to the point of 40, 45, 50 times a minute. So they're doing that all by themselves. So the idea that you would naturally expect it to be down. What's another reason as to why it might be down? And I've kind of been beating on this drum. We'll talk about this with your module test. Why might it be down? Yeah, perfusion. Perfusion is lousy. And so the idea that anytime you have a shock factor that's going on, you have to consider the possibilities of perfusion being poor, hence the end title being down. Make sense? But Trevor, you were right on in terms of it can be up at the retaining CO2. So they're just kind of chugging along, breathing about 3 or 4 times a minute because there are narcotics on board, then naturally you would expect it to be up at that point. Make sense? So same with management. IV, normal saline, KBO. And again, the fluids are not going to solve whatever this issue is along the way. It's not going to flush out the whatever we've got. It's just a matter for access more than anything else. Very Peter says, I kind of talked about this. The importance of 12 leads, and especially depending on what the agent is. You can have an ever-changing landscape with 12 leads right before your eyes. It's pretty incredible. Next week, Jill's talking to you about hyperkalemia and doing a 12-lead prior to giving medications and then after. The idea that you get bicarb, the idea you get calcium, the idea you get big, fat, wide urines along the way that narrows up and rate increases right before your eyes. So that's an example of this right here. The so-called coma cocktail is gone. It used to be, back in the good old days, used to be that somebody was unconscious automatically, even before checking glucose, automatically they got E50, they got Narcan, they got a drug called thiamine, they got romantic. So romanticon, what's the other name of it? Romantic. So the idea that automatically when you get that, just to see which one's going to work. No longer that's the case. A little bit smarter. So the idea, though, is that we're still getting glucose very, very quickly along the way. We're ruling out the possibility of narcotic overdose. Thiamine is not carried in Spokane, but some larger cities. Chicago is a good example of that. Los Angeles, New York City, it's all carried. And we'll talk about thiamine here a little bit as we get into alcohol. So thiamine is a vitamin. B12 vitamin that's given where they're short on B12 because of alcohol on board, and romanticon just because of the possibility of somebody being unfettered. So that's gone. So this is spot on. The idea that you want to check a glucose early on, and especially let me stop my foot. I'm going to ask you about it. Stop my foot. You want to get a glucose in all cases with those that are going through alcohol withdrawal. Always and forever. Serial check along the way. Okay? Big deal. And big deal is massive by many students along the way. We're asking about it.
Why the serial checks?
Because they can go down the slippery slope very, very quickly. Alcohol is one of those things, especially going through withdrawal. Alcohol is one of those things where their glucose is maintaining, and then all of a sudden so again, it can change right before your eyes, then going from a conscious state to unconscious state, and you assume it's just about alcohol withdrawal, when in fact it's more about hypoglycemia. Make sense? We'll talk about this one. It then indicated then we want to push some D50. And you already know about this, but the idea is that if you have narcotic intoxication that you suspect or that you confirm, giving Narcan along the way. And knowing, and just being reminded about this, that narcotics will last a whole lot longer than Narcan, right? So the idea that when you end up at the receiving facility, you're frequently be a Narcan drip for a period of time to that narcotic wears off. In all cases, anytime we're talking about toxins, in all cases, we're prepared for the possibility of seizures, this condition getting worse. We talk about inhalation, talking about can be self-induced or result of exposure. We talked about it earlier on. The idea that you use a firefighter coming out of the interior, the idea that you can be exposed to both CO and cyanide, especially if you're what am I trying to say? Fire's out, and you're still working within the just with that company. Sorry. Commonly abused inhaled toxins would be paint and freon. Our friend here, if you can see around his mouth, the gold thing around his mouth. Does anybody take care of patients like that? Yeah. Well, I'll come for them. They're usually kind of remember. Yeah.
Mine didn't have a bad outcome. He was very irritable and not very pleasant to be around.
Well, hopefully it's kind of that way. Anybody else? Yes, right. Good outcome, poor outcome.
Oh, I was romantic college did it a lot. You all right though?
Did you finish college? So when I was stationed in Germany military side, we had a gel that was 12 that was helping in basement, both in bed and for mattress. So it's still out there, and that was years and years ago, the idea that it's still out there, and the possibility, especially with kids being curious about it, and hear about talking. So, well, how do they present? Upper or down? Down. So initially, it's going to be about up. Okay, so Freon, will create this hyperventilating type of thing. Over a period of time, you usually hear what become
Well, they just put it in a bag and then up there.
Yeah,
It's all the meat, but before you get on the bag, you should try it. You gotta figure out how to do it.
I mean, I want to be a good medic.
Yeah, like also, upside down.
So in most cases, they're doing exactly that. They're spraying it into a bag and then they're at that point. And like we're talking about here, the idea is from where from that bag to end up going to live. Yep.
Gas bells.
You're asking the wrong
That's correct.
You got possibilities.
Okay, stick.
Another big one, it's like an air duster thing.
So we talked about when we studied ammo nitrate, the idea that you can have somebody with addiction to that. I'm not quite certain what that does. Maybe all, but I'm not quite certain as to why the addiction would be part of that. As toxins inhaled, option is displaced with respiratory system. The idea, especially about carbon monoxide, the idea that cyanide will follow the very same thing. And we're talking about these huffers will be the exact same way. That probably the way that you're going to find them is in a hypoxic state, probably ready to carry it. So I'm supposed to tell you to wear protective clothing. I'm supposed to tell you about BSI. I'm supposed to tell you about taking care of yourself. But do not underestimate the possibility of what you're walking into based on this right here. You may think that you're walking into one thing, that's completely different. Some poisons, phosphates, cyanide, can get absorbed in the skin using membranes. We'll talk about organophosphates here in a couple of minutes. Slower onset, but longer action. So the idea in terms of absorption of the skin, the idea to break that cycle as far as decom, the idea to get somewhere else along the way, you kind of break this right here as far as the reaction into the body. So toxicology, you know this. Toxicology is a set of signs and symptoms based on whatever the agent is. So it's a general thing of signs and symptoms based on whatever the agent is. Specific signs that consistently occur after ingestion of a particular toxin or drug class or agent. It's often set up with the basic history of the physical exam. In other words, what they take, how much they take, pill bottles along the way, everything we'll talk about at this point. Rapid identification of a toxidome saves time, saves your life, or saves the patient's life. The idea in terms of what's figuring out is what that agent is, a better fluid for what we're doing. Again, poison control is going to be your friend as far as this along the way. So based on your own thing, you can kind of figure out. Anticoagulant, you need to know this. When I'm talking about TCA, tricyclic antidepressant, it's about TCA. TCA is classic in terms of psychotic type things. If somebody is overdosing on atropine, talking about anticholinergic. If somebody is taking these agents, usually it's very, very quick. But look at the way they present. Line as a bat, hot as a hair, dry as a bone, red as a beet, mad as a hatter. Tell me how this thing is with that. Crazy, right? So the idea they're going to be up, they're going to be in your face, slapping you, they're going to be violent as a possibility. The skin is going to be red and flushed. They're probably going to have a temperature until they don't, and they're unconsciously dying right before your eyes. Okay, so check this out in terms of signs and symptoms. What is mydriasis?
Dilation of.
Somebody look it up. Tell me what that is.
Come on, Melanie, look it up.
Dilation of pupil.
Yep. So big old dilation of pupils. Remember I was talking earlier on, the dilated pupils can be virtually anything, right? Include this. So mydriasis, blurred vision, the result of dilated pupils, of fever, flushed dry skin, psychosis, coma, seizures. Ileus is about the abdomen. Don't get to remember that per se. Urinary retention is a big deal. The kidneys cannot kick off water. There's ADH is a big deal as far as hanging on to the school. Hypertension is a result of that. Tachycardia.
So is this like bath salts and PCP right here as well?
No, well, it can be in terms of how they present, but the anticholinergic is the one we're talking about right now. So anything in terms of these would be your setup. Your patient absolutely